Well, hello everyone. Welcome to week 2 of our learning journey in regenerative finance. If you were with us last week, you'll see I have a different backdrop because I'm at the community house where all of the people who have come from around the world to do work in Body Char are living. And I'm here because after this webinar is over, I have to quickly run over to the notary where we're going to complete the land purchase for the nature reserve that we're buying here in Body Char. So I'll have a less nature-oriented, maybe a little less inspiring background, but very excited that my reason for being indoors now is so that we can very soon be outdoors getting calluses on our hands with pickaxes and trowels and other things, digging water retention systems and planting trees. But enough of that. Very excited to be here with all of you today, where we're going to be talking about Prosocial. And I can already see as folks are coming into the chat and dropping comments and saying hello, please keep doing that. It's always nice to see the chatter that's happening in the chat box. But while we're waiting, I would also love to give you a poll related to today's topic. So I'd love it if you could just quickly answer this poll. Who in this group, who here is confused about what Prosocial is? Is it something that you don't know much about? Is it something you're pretty familiar with? This is sort of like a litmus test that'll help give me a sense of how I should shape the presentation today. So I can see already that several people are a little confused, but we're running 50-50 right now, neck and neck. Which one is going to win? It's sort of like a race, at least it's like a game. No, really what I'm seeing from your responses is that it will be good for me. It will be good for me to have lovely friends here. I have a brilliant architect who does all kinds of awesome things, and she very kindly made me a glass of tea. So I'll have this while we're chatting today. I'll be sure and make some time to explain what Prosocial is as we're getting started. And so we'll cover that as we begin. So hi, Rafaela, I see you there from Panama. You're very close, but not quite close enough. You got to get down here sometime. Yeah, so let's go ahead and get started. What we're going to be talking about today is a way into regenerative finance that I have not seen done before. Now, others may have done it. I'm only speaking to my own ignorance here. I've not seen it done. And that is to begin talking about regenerative economics and regenerative finance through the foundational experience of being in community, by having a way of understanding how to be in a group, how to function as part of a group, and have the elements and the supports of the group be something that enables an economic flow to occur. And since we're all familiar with being in groups, have experience with being in community, we can draw from our own lived experiences to understand regenerative finance before getting into the more technical tools that some people will be very familiar with and other people will be beginners and not know very much. And so this is a way for us to build a shared understanding while also getting some insights into how to work together in the projects that we're going to run in this learning journey. So let me begin before starting the slideshow by reminding us that the Ask a Question button is right here, and during the presentation, if you pose a question there, or if you vote for questions you'd like to hear, those will be the questions that we'll use during the discussion section after the presentation. And also, I'd like to just take a moment and explain very briefly what Prosocial is, what being Prosocial is, before we get into this framework called Prosocial, which could be a bit confusing if we don't understand the relationship between the two. So Prosocial is, as the word suggests, to be supportive of or to be helped by things that are social. So a prosocial behavior is something that is generous, kind, understanding, accepting, cooperative, based in trust, altruistic. So any behavior that is increasing the amount of social interaction because people get benefits from the social interaction is a prosocial behavior. So if you're in a group and you're being antisocial, you're not giving to the group generously, you're not cooperating very well, you might be closed-minded or judgmental, withdrawn and guarded, and all of those would be antisocial. Prosocial would be in the other direction, to be engaged, to be enthusiastic, to have motivation and passion, to really care for the same things, to trust in the other people and their good intentions, to be open-minded about how things are going and that people really mean well in their interactions with you. All of these are aspects of being pro-social. What we're going to talk about today is how being pro-social creates a special kind of commons, which is a functioning social context for a healthy group, and how this is the basis for creating regenerative economies. So with that said, let me just see the poll again. Oh yeah, it came out 50-50. Just would love to know what the +1 or a -1, if that is a good enough definition to go with for pro-social for now. So in the chat box, if you could just give me +1 if you feel comfortable enough with what being pro-social is, and -1 if you're still a little confused. And that feedback will help me as we get started with the presentation. So to drop in your +1 or your -1 into the chat box. Looks like so far a lot of people are understanding. This is great. I don't want to spend too much time waiting for interactions that people can't see later in the recording, but wonderful, lots of positive response. Thank you for that response. All right, then let's go ahead and get started with the presentation for today. Here we go. So today's presentation, as I said, is called Prosocial as Regenerative Finance. Now, I'm really saying this intentionally as though it's a metaphor and not a simile, for those of you who know your grammar, that we really mean that prosocial is a kind of regenerative finance, and regenerative finance is a way of explaining what it means to be prosocial. So we're going to really look at how we can learn from one domain to have better insights into other. So we're going to start by learning about prosocial as a source of experience in our lives to help us apply what we know from those experiences to what it might mean to engage in regenerative finance. So that's the goal for the webinar today. All right, here's a really deep, profound thing that you've probably heard someone say before, but it bears saying again because it's foundational to what we're talking about today. That the web of life, the biosphere of the earth that has existed continuously for 3.6 to 3.8 billion years is a tapestry of dynamic relationships. There are predator-prey relationships, there are symbiotic relationships, there are mother-daughter relationships or parent-child relationships. There are many different kinds of relationships. But the important thing is that it's a tapestry of dynamic relationships. That is what a web of life is. You remember in the previous webinar, we talked about autopoiesis, the dynamic of a living organism to perpetuate itself. This is saying that dynamic exists within a larger tapestry of dynamic relationships. And from there, we can start to get a beginning of an understanding of regenerative economies. So here I'm saying the foundation of regenerative economies is healthy relationships combined with the capacities to take collective actions or to do things that are healthy to the whole, to the entire ecosystem or the entire web of life. We apply this to humans, we say the foundation of regenerative human economies is healthy social relationships. So if we relate well to each other, if we relate well to land, if we relate well to non-human species, then these relationships combined create the foundations of regenerative economies. So regenerative human economies are fundamentally and profoundly social. Why do I say that? Because we are going to build an understanding together of how to create a regenerative economy through our relationships with each other and with the more than human world. Here I have a graphic that is kind of complex, and I'm going to cover it briefly because it's really just meant to give us a beginning of an understanding of regenerative economics together. This graphic is produced by John Fullerton of the Capital Institute, and I find it very helpful. He identified 8 principles for regenerative economy, and we want to create finance tools that embody these principles. So very briefly, I'll just run through these quickly to give you an idea that a regenerative economy is in right relationship. Humans are in right relationship with their water, with the watersheds. Humans are in right relationship with each other, so rich people and poor people, and marginalized and privileged, and so on. And also human and non-human relationships are in right relationship. From this basis of right relationship, you can view wealth holistically, the health of the entire economy, the health of everyone involved, not just reducing it to monetary flow like gross domestic product is. Also, regenerative economies tends to be very innovative, adaptive, and responsive. They are evolving and they guide their own evolution. They adapt themselves to changing environments, or they change environments to become more adaptive. This means that the participants within the economy have empowered abilities to participate. They actually are able to co-create these adaptive responses. They're able to creatively navigate changes and create better holistic health outcomes and remain in right relationship the whole time. They do this in part by honoring place and community, which maybe is self-explanatory. You don't pee in the water you drink in, for example. And a really key factor of ecosystems is that there's abundance at the edge, what's called edge effect abundance. You go at the boundary between two domains, you'll find there's a rich creative space where the two of them intersect. And regenerative economies thrive in these edge places. They do this because they have robust circulation. Whatever valuable things that enable them to be alive, remember autopoiesis from last week, the dynamic of a living system, that dynamic is perpetually, robustly circulating. And it does this by always seeking balance, never finding balance. It's never completely stationary or static because it's always evolving and changing, but it's finding harmony within its relationships as it goes. Now, these are the 8 principles of regenerative economics articulated by John Fullerton. As you can see, if we create finance tools that cultivate or embody these principles, then we're working in a good direction. Now, we're going to be talking about prosocial today, so I want to name something. This is a quote paraphrased by the behavioral economist Herb Gintis. He said, the key adaptation in human evolution is teamwork, our ability to engage in team hunting for big game, our ability to have shared language and shared communication with each other, shared narratives and shared cosmologies, and so on. Our ability to work well as groups is a key difference between humans and all other mammals, and in many ways, a difference between humans and all other living beings. And so if we think this way, culture is a web of dynamic interactions, and humans are teams managing these dynamic interactions by living within a culture. A key finding from evolutionary studies, articulated by David Sloan Wilson, who is also one of the authors of the Prosocial book, is that selfishness beats altruism within groups. The selfish individual can win against the altruistic individuals within a group, but altruistic groups or cooperative groups beat selfish groups. Everything else is commentary. So if we want to create regenerative economies, we need to have economies that are very cooperative within themselves so they can outcompete extractive economies. Extractive economies are inherently selfish, and they benefit the most selfish or even psychopathic people within those economies. So if we want to beat the selfish economies, we need to have really good cooperation within our cooperative economies. This is a finding that applies across all living things and especially for human culture. So how do we form these altruistic groups? How do we create groups that are pro-social? That's the question for today. Here's my claim, or the argument I want to make today, is that our ability to create regenerative economies will depend on how well we create and maintain commons of various kinds. So ecological commons might be healthy rivers, healthy soils, biodiversity, a stable weather system, access to land to maintain the health of all these ecological things. But commons can also be social, like trust and cooperation, the ability to share knowledge, making decisions together through community governance, having a shared identity or a shared purpose can be a common, or having public spaces or gathering places where people can come together, which could be physical or virtual. So any of these commons are foundational for creating regenerative economies. So today what we're going to focus on is how commons work as part of being prosocial. So prosocial, from the website prosocial.world, is an integrative framework. It brings together many different domains of research. It's very robust. It's got foundational pillars in 3 core areas, each of which is an amalgamation of lots of other research. One of them is the core design principles for managing the commons. We'll talk more about in a moment. Another one is a field called contextual behavioral science, which is an integration of cognitive and behavioral sciences, as well as therapeutic and organizational management and organizational psychology and related fields. And also a strong foundation in evolutionary studies, looking at the evolution of cooperation. Now that's a lot to cover. So for today, we're just going to focus on one. We're going to look at the core design principles for managing the commons and how to be pro-social when managing something together. Eleanor Ostrom, to this day, I believe, is still the only woman to win the Nobel Prize in Economics. I may be wrong because I don't remember for last year, but she got the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009 as a political scientist who spent decades studying human groups in real-world settings where people managed common pooled assets, things like a shared fishery or grazing land for livestock, things like this. And what she found was all of the people she studied, they always managed their commons well when they met 8 criteria, which she called the core design principles. And they are this. Core design principle number 1, which we talked about in the webinar last week, is that the group of people managing a commons have a shared identity and a shared purpose. It's pretty obvious in this rowboat where everyone has the same outfits on, they have the same objective, they're all rowing together as a team, their identity is contained in the boat itself and the unified rowing that they do. Or the ants that are gathering together to climb up and reach the flower. There can be a shared identity and a shared purpose. And any group that does not have this is not going to manage itself as a group very well. Core design principle number 2 says that there's an equitable share of contributions and benefits. Notice this doesn't mean it's always equal. Those who do more work get more benefits. Those who do less work get less benefits. And if that is balanced well, then the group can function and it can manage whatever is commonly held. Core design principle says that there is fair and inclusive decision making. There are members of the group, they make decisions fairly, and they're included in how decisions are made, including how to change the way decisions are made. So think of a lot of First Nations groups, like here we have a depiction of the Iroquois Nation, which was famous for its governing and its democracy. Much of the US tripartite government was borrowed from the model of the Iroquois Nation. And so for all of the problems of US government, there is an element of democracy there, hidden somewhere within an oligarchy that is built on these practices. And we can say the US government's politics don't work when decision-making is not fair or inclusive. Which you could think of lots of examples, I'm sure, for when that is not met. Core design principle number 4 says that when there are behaviors people agree on, that the group members themselves can easily monitor those agreements. Here's an example from a very powerful elementary school intervention called the Good Behavior Game, which is based in contextual behavioral science, which invites a group of children in 2nd grade to make a list of what they want to see more of, what they want to hear more of, what they want to feel more of, and what they want to see themselves do. Like they want to see more kids playing together, hear more laughter, feel more safety and acceptance, feel more happiness, etc., etc. And what this allows them to do by making this list public on the wall in the classroom is the students themselves can make comments when they see, hear, feel, or do these things. And together they monitor their behaviors, reinforcing the positive behaviors that they want to see. And this has been effective in the more than 13,000 public schools that have used the Good Behavior Game in the last 30 years. This way of monitoring agreed behaviors, transparency and inclusive monitoring of behavior for shared goals helps groups to function well and to manage their commons well. Core design principle number 5 says that there's graduated responding to helpful and unhelpful behavior. That means the initial unhelpful behaviors get a small response, the bigger unhelpful behaviors get a larger response, and so on. Same thing for the positive behaviors. There's an example of this drawn from the book Moral Origins by Christopher Bohm. He's a primate anthropologist who studied non-human primates and then later human social behavior. And he observed that the origin of democracy and egalitarianism in hunter-gatherer societies comes about because there are 3 kinds of responses to selfish or antisocial behavior. The first response is gossiping about the good and bad behaviors. So telling stories about each other, scolding and reprimanding, rewarding and complimenting. And when that doesn't work, they raise the stakes to temporary or permanent banishment. Someone's really behaving badly, they might kick them out. And if you happen to have a psychopath or a serial killer in your midst, then in very rare cases, they even go to the level of capital punishment and killing the person. Although in the on the ethnographic record, which is very rare. What this shows is that there are different levels of responding at different times, and this allows flexible, adaptive responses as people learn how to be good participants of their communities. Core design principle number 6 says that there is fast and fair conflict resolution. Conflicts inevitably arise within groups, and so they need to have ways of resolving them that are relatively fast and that are done in a way that everyone involved feels is fair. Core design principle number 7 says that any group has the authority to govern itself. So if you're a group of people managing a fishery and you don't have the ability to manage the fishery because there are other government jurisdictions, then you cannot manage it effectively and your fishery may collapse, as happened in this map here in the New York metropolitan area and north into the Gulf of Maine. So what's important here is that if there is a group that manages a commons, they need to have the ability, the autonomy to govern themselves. Core design principle number 8 says that if there are other groups that your group interacts with, the other 7 principles apply to these interactions. So the group itself is a commons, but the group relating with other groups as collaboration or partnerships, those partnerships are also commons, so they need to meet the same criteria. And this creates a sort of fractal pattern where you can have groups within groups within groups, growing up to ever larger sizes, where they all meet the same commons management requirements. So the reason that I just went through these is that these 8 core design principles allow us to have a very clear way of thinking, almost a diagnostic checklist. Are these 8 principles being met for any commons that we're managing? And when they are met, how does that help people to be more trusting, cooperative, generous, altruistic, and participate in the groups that they're in? And how does this relate to regenerative planning? Well, you recall from last week, I very briefly said that finance is a set of coordination tools for the flow of value within the commons. You can't hear me. I think there's something wrong with my speaker because it did it with the recording the other day too. Can they hear me if I speak closer? Is this, Tyler, is this better? I think something got damaged on my microphone on my computer. It's better when closer. Okay, I'll talk loud and I hope the roommates in the house don't mind too much. Now basically, finance is a set of coordination tools for flow of value within economy. And we do this within a regenerative framework, and it's regenerative finance. We also said that we would learn regenerative finance in our community Zoom calls by focusing on the conversational dynamics of our learning journey. And we will focus on how we experience value that is created as we're in these groups. So here is our opportunity for this week. If we take the same way of thinking and say, focus on the conversational dynamics, and we put the core design principles into those dynamics, then we can look at how well are we building shared identity and purpose? How well do we share the benefits and costs? Are we monitoring agreed behaviors? Do we have fair and inclusive decisions? Do we have fair and inclusive conflict resolution? And so on for all 8 principles. When we do this, what we'll see is our ability to manage our groups as commons is also our ability to coordinate the exchange of value within groups, which means as we coordinate the exchange of value within groups, we are behaving as a financial system without having money, without having other monitoring tools that we normally would call finance. So when we recognize that these dynamic features of a social group are what enable the group to function as a regenerative finance system, to behave as a regenerative economy, we can start to look for these design principles within our groups as we are participating in the groups and practice improving our groups as a way of designing regenerative finance. So we might notice that there's a value exchange happening in the breakout groups on the community Zoom calls that doesn't happen on the platform, which is text-based, when people write comments below a post. So what is it about those breakout groups facilitated by our hosts on the Zoom calls that enables regenerative finance to flow that is different from the online platform? You see what I'm getting at here? We can look at our own social dynamics using these design principles to see how to build and improve our regenerative finance tools. coordinate the creation and exchange of value so it flows as the embodiment of regenerative economics within our social group. And the extent to we do that, that will be how much we're engaging in regenerative finance. So how does this apply to regenerative finance? That's what we're going to discuss now. So that's the end of the presentation. It's sort of like a provocation for us to begin a discussion. And now I'd love to start a conversation about this. And apologies for the technical problems on my computer with the audio, but I hope that was good enough to make some sense. Yeah, I see lots of comments saying they couldn't hear parts of it. I hope you were able to hear enough. I would love now to use a little bit of this time for any questions or comments, which you can pose in the Ask a Question button here, as well as in the comment thread. So are there any questions or comments that people would like to make based on what you've seen? Clarifying questions about what is prosocial, what is a regenerative economy, what is a commons, how do these core design principles relate to creating regenerative finance, and how can we look at our own social group behaviors to see how to build regenerative finance models? Are there questions or comments about this? Is it confusing? Does it not make any sense? Can you hear me? Or is the audio not coming through? I'd love to hear from you. So are there any questions coming in? I will pose a question just in case. Here's my poll question. Can you hear me okay when I speak like this? That's my question. So I know how to be sure and use the microphone. So if you could answer this poll, that would be helpful. And I see some questions coming in. Let's see here. Kathy has asked, what is a commons in the context of private land ownership? And Gail asked, can we discuss a real-world example of this? So I may start with Gail's question because that one's more general, and then we'll come to Kathy's question next. And I invite Gail onto the screen so we can discuss it. Can we discuss a real-world example of this? So Gail, if you're there, I'd love to see you in chat. The important thing about finding real-world examples is we can look for real-world examples of commons. We can look for real-world examples of pro-social groups, and we can look at real-world examples of regenerative economies. Any of those would fit this question. So Gail, if you're able to join me, maybe you can help me choose which of those we look at to start getting a better handle on how to think about this. It seems that for some reason she's having a hard time coming on. Technology is slow. Let me start giving an example of a commons. I'd already mentioned a fishery could be a commons, but another commons might be let's say this crowdcast call and the webinar, where we have a shared space for chats. We have a shared space for listening and having dialogue. We have a shared space for asking and answering questions. But does it meet all the criteria of a commons, where you may not have fair and inclusive decision-making about the topics that I choose or how I present them? You may not be able to resolve conflicts very easily about technology problems like sound not working. So we can see that this is an example of something that is a commons, that we could look at the criteria for how the commons is understood. But another example we could look at of a regenerative economy is to look at an ant colony. If you look at an ant colony, you'll see that an ant colony is a living system that's comprised of, in some cases, several million ants, and that those ants are all cooperating toward a shared goal, which is to keep the queen and the hive healthy, and that they have robust circulation of materials to maintain an internal temperature, to keep enough food coming to all the larvae, to keep the workers coordinated and gathering and bringing back supplies, and so on. And so all of the elements of a regenerative economy are present, and the hive itself is a commons managed by all of the members of the colony. So those are two examples. I don't know if that's good enough. Maybe Gail, if you could drop a message in the chat and tell me if that was good enough, since for some reason I wasn't able to have you join me. But those are two real-world examples that can help us understand what a regenerative economy is, and also a little bit about how to manage a commons and how to see what a commons is. So the next question I have here is from Kathy. So I'll invite Kathy onto the screen, and hopefully it works this time. I'm not sure if it's going to work, Kathy, or not. I'll invite you one more time. Kathy's asking the question, but for some reason it's not letting me invite you. I don't know why. It says, what is a commons in the context of private land ownership? I'll answer this question historically, which is, how did the commons get destroyed, and what can we learn from that? Which is the story of the enclosure movement of the British Isles in the 1600s, which is also the birthplace of Kathy. Hey, Kathy, are you there? Hi, welcome. I was getting started in case you couldn't join me, but would you like to add some context to this conversation before I go any further?
Oh, well, really, that was just, you know, a question off the top of my head, because I haven't had a lot of experience of thinking in terms of commons myself. And, you know, it seems as though the big question that's confronting you in Barichara and probably in many places in the world is that the areas that are in such bad need of regeneration are not common lands that everyone has access to. First you have to buy it, then you have to regenerate it.
Yeah, this actually goes back to a very specific time in history in 17th century Britain, when there had been 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years, where peasant farmers, if they managed their land, they had the rights to use it. And they actually called it the commons, or the common land. And what happened was there was a legal act, ironically passed by the House of Commons, which said that, which was called the Enclosure Act, which said that a private member of the nobility class could become a landowner, and as the owner of land, they could charge rent. And if a peasant farmer couldn't afford to pay rent, they were forced to leave. And this was the first corporate land grab. And this took the philosophy of John Locke and others of private ownership and moved it forward in time until right now, there's very little private land left, and almost all value created in the global economy is privatization, which is value created in commons that is then extracted and stolen for private gain, which is a very, very common practice. It's sort of the refined version of colonialism. And what's interesting is, once you have a landscape that's filled with private land, all of the incentives are around individuals gaining personal gain from the land they have in competition with their neighbors. The way that plays out here in Barichara is if there is a wellspring of surface water, water coming out of the ground, all of the neighbors fight over bringing their hoses or their pipes to take water from that hole in the ground. And you end up with lots of conflicts over the water, which has a popular name, the tragedy of the commons, famously articulated in a 1957 science article by Garrett Hardin. And so what's interesting is our ability to regenerate landscapes requires us to treat them as commons. So we have to figure out how to build commons where they don't exist, or to leverage existing commons to build new commons on top of it, which is why I was focusing so much on commons are a foundation to weave a tapestry of relationships, and then you have a regenerative economy. Does that make more sense to you, Kathy?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And also, someone asked in the chat box, they're wondering what that bird is that's in the background because it's so beautiful. Do you know who the bird is that's singing behind you?
I don't.
Bird aficionados, bonus points for putting that in the chat. I don't know which one of these is. But thank you so much for the question, Kathy, and a very, very important one. So thank you for asking. Awesome. Onward we go. We have some more questions coming in. I see there's a question here by Tyler. So I'll invite Tyler into the chat. Tyler's question is it useful to think of the economy as a commons itself, or is it more helpful to think of it as an emergent system of relationships and exchange between commons and private property? I think I know where Tyler's going with this one, which is to say that private property is often anti-commons, but you can weave it into the commons in some way. But I have a feeling Tyler's got some thoughts on this. And Tyler's upstairs to me right now. So, hi, Tyler.
Hey, Joe.
Echo effect. Tyler, tell me more what you're thinking here, because
Yeah.
you got something to say.
So I'm curious if it's, I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm saying like really useful as people trying to practice regenerative finance, as people who want to be building a regenerative economy. If it's actually useful for us to think about this larger system of relationships between individuals, our individual desires, our cultural desires, and the commons that we relate with and have some form of like ideally pro-social governance over, and the private property that we may own or may have some sort of relationship to, whether we should prioritize our thinking around those common assets that we can actually manage together with others pro-socially, and not worry so much about this kind of interconnected system that goes beyond sets of commons, or if eventually it is useful for us to think about governing and managing the economy as a whole as a commons, or if that's too much of a kind of predict and control mindset for something that is such a complex dynamic system.
Yeah, I would say there's a strategic sort of priority question, which is that in the context you're acting within, you may be required or you may be unable to avoid interacting with the extractive system and whatever part of it may be. And so there are pragmatic, practical choices that need to be made. But I would also say overall, strategically, the more we can build and strengthen commons and connect them to each other, the better we will be able to create the economic system. And I think what gets interesting here is in structures versus processes, because we might have some market structures embedded within a commons, and then it will be a commoning process. The market could be a commons. Or you could have a market that inherently destroys commons, because it's a process of commons destruction that the market is based on. So it's not the structures of the market specifically, it's how they relate to their context. And so I think this way of getting clear about structure and process as webs of relationships, which is always going to be very complex and never have really clear boundaries, but clear enough at least to work with, is going to be how we answer this question in practice. Because the real world is always going to be some mix. And we just have to do our best within the messiness of that. But I think it's a really important question. And it gets at a lot of things about how much do we try to change the old system versus building the new one that, as Buckminster Fuller famously said, makes the old one obsolete, or other strategies that we might use. And I think that keeping that inquiry open is really important, to remain humble that we often don't know which one's better. Just as I know you're learning here with some of the people in Barichara, that really great work can be done on private land when the private landowners treat the land as a commons, even though it's legally private. Because commoning, the verb of to create a commons, is the practice of treating something as a commons, which is not the same as its legal definition. So that ambiguity is a great place to be creative, as we're discovering. So yeah, thanks for that question. Do you have anything else you'd like to add before we move on? No, thank you for the great question, Tyler. So yeah, this question of sort of strategy and pragmatics is going to remain important to us. That's not going to stop anytime soon. So I see I've got a question here from Rafaela. Let's see if she's able to join us. The question is, I'm seeing these groups A and B potentially as two pilot international regenerative economies. When you say observe the behaviors, it's learning while doing. Does that make sense? Oh, I hope the technology works. You can join me because we're going to have fun on this one. Hello, how are you?
Hello, hi.
Great to see you.
Good to talk to you.
Yeah, I just want to start by saying, how's life in Panama? How are you guys holding up? How's the family?
It's fantastic. Big Copenhagen, and I'm finally settling in. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. It's just cutting out a little bit.
Yeah, internet is not that good.
Well, I'd love to get into your question, because for me, your question is like, it's almost like we gave you the question to give back to us. Like you're, with someone who planted in the audience, which isn't the case. But I just want to say that what you're asking is exactly what we have in mind: to consciously evolve regenerative economies in the way we interact with each other. And then also we could do crowdfunding. We could create financial mechanisms to support ourselves, members of these groups. So some members of Group A might decide that they want to create an internship program to support people's livelihoods for a certain kind of reforestation work. And then they raise the money to do it with their own friends using crowdfunding. Or so they may create a financial mechanism to coordinate value exchange. But before we get into the financial part, we need to have an experience. What is it like? What does it feel like to be in these relationships? How do we create more of this? How do we monitor it? And then how does our ability, our analytic ability to do that, help us to design and build financial tools? So that's the pedagogical arc. But also, we have fantastic people in this learning journey. We're going to be able to do so much cool stuff together. So yeah, totally. What do you think about this? What comes to mind for you as a participant? Like, what kinds of things are stirred up for you when thinking about this?
I just wanted to say it out loud because I think it's clear in your mind and probably in the mind of other people. And I wanted to say it out loud, because I always have this feeling what is going on in Barichara is kind of clear, ongoing and complex, but clear. And what is going on around Barichara is instead foggy, but at the same time, it's very, it's not just words. And that's why I joined this group. And so I just wanted to say we are not only learning, this is not a school where we do theory. We are building something. I don't know what, but yep.
Yep, here's my high five. I got my high five right here. You named it beautifully. That's the whole idea, is for us to regenerate by doing. So thank you for the question, and it's lovely to see you. I look forward to catching up in person when we get the chance to. So thank you. But it looks like her video fell away a little bit. So let's see so we've got a couple of questions here. I got one from Darren Zoll, which I'll maybe take next. I'll invite Darren onto the screen. His question is, do altruistic groups still outcompete selfish groups when those groups are part of a larger group, in which each group would sort of be like an individual in the larger group? This is a question that is really important, which is that selfish groups often are cooperative with each other. So imagine you're a bunch of Ayn Rand fans. Those of you who don't know Ayn Rand, she popularized a very pathological version of libertarianism, which basically is the more selfish you are, the better it is for everyone. And if you have a group of people who all agree to be selfish together, they can do things like write legislation and rig elections. And they're deeply and profoundly cooperative. But they're actually a cooperative group. They're an altruistic group with selfish goals. But I don't know if that is clear enough. Darren, let's talk more about this, because I'm curious what you're thinking in asking this question, because I see lots of directions we can go. Tell me a little more of what you're thinking here.
Yeah, I guess I was just kind of thinking about it in kind of a fractal way. Like, like if you think about each group as being itself an individual, like in a part of a larger group, like does that same like saying apply of like, like with those, yeah, I guess, would the altruistic group still be would still win like in the end? Because it does seem like in our world, we do have these groups, but then like they're kind of part of a larger group, like a nation or whatever. So yeah, like we have like groups within groups.
Yeah, one thing that's interesting is like the word altruism might sound like we're talking about being nice, but I might be altruistic by being a suicide bomber. So I'm very generously giving to my group by murdering a bunch of people in another group. So altruism is an antisocial behavior to the other group, but a very pro-social behavior within the suicide bomber group. And so it's very important, when David Sloan Wilson developed a mathematical framework for clarifying the principle he described in that quote, they had to do the bookkeeping correctly. And if you're consistent in the bookkeeping, then you find that that pro-social is defined in relation to the group that you're in. And it could also be defined to a group at a different level if you're also part of that group. An example would be you might have kidney cells in your body that are part of your body, but then you might have cancerous kidney cells in your body that are destroying your kidney and destroying your body. So your kidney cells are part of two levels of groups, the kidney group and the whole body group. You could also maybe say the blood filtering group or some larger cluster of organs, organ system. And so it's really helpful for us to look at nested levels. It's not just hierarchical levels, they're nested. That the subgroup functions within a larger group, and the larger group functions as a relationship with, of the nested groups within it. And when we think that way, then this part-whole relationship of selfishness and altruistic starts to make more sense. Your kidneys are in a sense being very altruistic to your body by filtering your blood. They're being cooperative with the rest of your body. And if there's something wrong with your kidneys, they're not filtering very well, then they're not being cooperative. Of course, we're personifying parts of your body by doing this, but if you think the same way for an economy, the logic still applies. Does that start to make more sense?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks.
Yeah, it's the nested hierarchical structure. The nestedness is where you see the interdependence. That's what takes the thing that could be really confusing and makes it functionally clear. You're like, oh, of course, the organelles are part of the organs that are part of the organ systems. There's a nestedness. And when we think about ecosystems or economies this way, the holistic aspect of it is more rigorous and more clear. Is that clear enough, or do you have any other questions about this? Is it something?
Oh, that cleared it up good, so thank you.
Awesome, thanks for the question, and glad you're here. Yeah, this is really some good questions, so thank you for that one, Darren. Let's see here, the next question I have here with 6 votes from Pamela. That one's getting shot up a lot. Here you go, Pamela. I'll find you on the screen. And the next question is Principle 2 regarding proportional benefits. Can you speak to that? It sounds like this distributes more benefits to those who contribute more. If so, what happens to those who are unable to contribute as much as another? Pamela, this is a great question, because this opens up the ability to be altruistic within the group. Let's say you're able to contribute more than I am in a group, but we're both very engaged in the group. You might actually give things to support me that enable me to give more to the group. So like I might have to work a lot and not have time, but if you were able to help me, like let me stay in a spare bedroom in your house so I don't have to pay rent, then I don't have to work as much and I have more time to participate in the group. But you're generously giving to me and to the group by doing that, you'd be an altruist. So what's interesting is that you can have people who give more by basically receiving less than their fair share to improve the group. And now we're starting to talk about something that almost sounds like regenerative finance. But I'm curious what you were thinking about this. Like what was on your mind?
It raised the question. I just wasn't quite clear how about the nuances of that principle and how they played out, because it sounded like it was going in the direction of those who were able to give more get more back from the group. I really don't understand it, so I'm not very. So that's why I'm asking the question. because if that was the case, living in a housing co-op, I see all the time a really base level of this kind of dynamic happening where there are people who will be quite active and do quite a lot for the co-op, and some who will not, and everyone gets the same benefits. And then you can have disharmony happening within the group. It seems to be so that's kind of my experience of that goes behind one way of shaping my understanding of this principle. And I don't know what it actually means from a prosocial point of view.
Yeah, I would say, paraphrasing what Kathy is paraphrasing from socialism, from each according to his ability to each according to his means, which is that if the group works as a commons, then what happens is everyone has an inclusive way to participate. So you might have one person, one vote within co-housing, even though some people have more and other people have less to contribute. So you have inclusive ways of making decisions, which meets one of the other principles. But what gets interesting is, how does the group treat a free rider versus someone who doesn't have the means? You know, a free rider is someone who just takes advantage of the group and they're able to give, but they don't. Whereas another person would give more, but they're not able to, and they benefit a lot from the group. And the difference is the ability to monitor agreed behaviors. So if you can monitor the agreed behaviors, you can find when someone's being a free rider and when someone's not. And so this is where we can see that these 8 core design principles never work in isolation. They're always interacting with each other. And so if we can't monitor the agreed behaviors, we don't even know how much someone's contributing. And we don't know if it's fair or not. And if we don't explore our shared identity and purpose, which could change, you know, as time goes on, that someone might be contributing well now, but not contributing later, and maybe they should leave the group or be asked to do more as the shared identity and purpose changes. And so this is what's interesting, is that, that these different principles are context dependent. They interact with each other and they can change as time goes on. And so, so there's not a simple way to answer your question. It's more, if you're in a specific context, we could explore the question in that context and see how it works.
What you say has helped me understand it better in relation to the other principles that so if you have an organization which doesn't include prosocial principles, then you have no mechanism or means for addressing issues that arise like this. That's kind of what I'm hearing, which makes having that framework and a mutually understood, a mutual understanding of that is what is necessary in order to keep that balance and harmony going in a group.
Yeah, it's like it's seeking balance, like it said in the regenerative economics principles.
Right.
Seeking balance means you can feel, there's a sense making that can feel when things are out of balance, and the system itself seeks balance.
Right.
One way to do that is to have inclusive decision making and monitoring of agreed behaviors. You have both of those, and you have fair conflict resolution. You have those 3, then you have a sense-making capacity.
Right.
And if you know what the shared identity and purpose is, you can redirect people's behavior back toward the purpose. And so they are, in this way, these design principles are the aspects of a living organism. A living organism is sense-making for its own health and well-being, which means it's very dynamic and very evolving. Does that make sense? Does that help you get a better feel that it's not like a recipe, it's always dynamic.
Yeah, and interrelated. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
I'm noticing that we We're getting to the point where we have a couple minutes left and we have a bunch of questions here. I'd like to maybe, if it's okay, just take 2 more questions and then we close so we can keep ourselves to the hour, trying to practice honoring the commons principles. So we'll just take the next 2 questions and go through them fairly quickly, just to be mindful of time, if that's okay with everyone. If I can get like a +1 in the chat box for that, -1 if you really feel like we should keep going. And I will invite the next person onto the screen while you're voting, which is Carrie. So Carrie, if you're there, I'll invite you onto the screen. And Carrie's question is, can this regenerative finance model work on the scale of a whole bioregion, which may not technically be a commons? And so the EcoTrust effort comes to mind. EcoTrust is awesome for those who don't know about them. And their Salmon Nation project that rolled out on its own is a beautiful example. So it seems our approach is for individuals coordinating small groups. What about bringing NGOs or government orgs into the model? Hey, Carrie, how are you? Good to see you
Hey,
again.
Joe, how's it going? Nice to see
It's been
you.
a long time.
Yes, but I'm still participating.
Yeah, your question relates a lot to Darren's question, which is that you can have different levels of groups. And so I'm curious if you maybe answer your own question. Do you think a bioregion can be managed as a commons? And what would be the requirements for it to do that? Do you have a sense of how you'd answer that question?
Yeah, I think it's the question we're probably all trying to figure out. I think you know, it's really like eco-governance of a whole region. And so I think figuring out how to do that in a way that makes sense for the region is very tricky. So EcoTrust is the only example I know of that is combining funds like that. There may be others, but just given that the time scale is pretty compressed here for a change of direction for humans, that's why I asked the question about, like, there are already these huge groups doing things. Is there a way to work with them in a more effective way as well?
Yeah, one of the things I was actually on a call just yesterday with David Sloan Wilson, and we were talking about applying Prosocial to community projects across Latin America. And he was describing the role of enlightened top-down, is the phrase he used, where you can have top-down interventions, but they're enlightened, they're wise, they're actually wise. And one way to be top-down and wise is to have the ability to bring institutional capacity to distributed local efforts, but allow the local efforts to govern themselves. That would be an enlightened way for a top-down response. And I think that this type of thinking, which is that things that operate on a larger scale need to meet Eleanor Ostrom's core. They're partnering with smaller groups. Those core design principles need to be met in their partnerships. So an example of this that I could give here in Barichara is we've raised money to create a bioregional scale investment platform, which we'll talk about later in the learning journey. And one of the things we're exploring is how to partner with Common Land Foundation. Common Land Foundation has a top-down intervention, which is a way of creating a zoning across the territory. This zone is just for conservation. This zone is for mixed conservation and economic use. But the way that Common Land Foundation interacts with local actors is by working with the Presidencing Institute in Theory U, which is facilitating the conditions of emergence, and that is bottom up. So if we have a fund that is coordinating projects across the territory, we want to do things like what Common Land Foundation does, which is to have top-down, shared vision, shared constraints, regulation of the territory that are agreed upon by the local actors, and then have ways the local actors can be autonomous, creative, adaptive, agile, and it's the blend between the two that really matters. And when that's happening, we're meeting Eleanor Ostrom's principles. So there are ways of doing this at large scales. And does that start to answer your question a little bit? Does that feel like it's more possible?
I think so. Unfortunately, the connection is not good, so you were cutting out quite a bit, but I'll try to watch the recording and see if I can catch any more.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know where it's gone. I hope it gets better in a moment. And thank you for the question. Hope the recording is good enough to get it back to you.
Thanks,
And
Joe.
it was great to see you.
Nice.
see we're right at the hour now. So we'll just maybe do one more question and then we'll wrap up. And Jonathan Cloud is asking a very good question. So I'll invite Jonathan onto the screen, which is, are you saying that private property is incompatible with regenerative finance? We started to answer this a little bit when Tyler was here, which is that private property may be incompatible, but if the private landowners treat the private property as a commons, then the commons doesn't matter the legal thing. It matters the cultural thing. I think this flexibility of going back and forth to find where the commons is allows private property to exist within frameworks of commons. But it's a very delicate matter, and that regenerative finance is about finding a healthy relationship. So this is a very nuanced question, and I'm hoping the technology will allow you to come on to make a comment before we wrap up. But looks like Jonathan is losing the video transmission. So I guess it's not going to work. Sorry about that, Jonathan. But I would say, just in summary, private land can work within the framework of cultural and legislative commons, but it requires those commons to be strong enough to be more pronounced than the private land dynamics themselves. So the commons needs to be strengthened. But private land can be part of a commons framework. So they're not specifically at odds with each other, just there's a tendency that privatization undermines the commons. And a lot of commons have been destroyed by creating privatized wealth. And so the dynamics need to be understood as part of regenerative finance as we go about doing this work. And I hope that's a good enough answer for now, considering that we're now at time. And so what I'd love to do is just to wrap up by saying thank you all for being here. I'm sorry about the technical challenges we're facing. I'll look into what's going on with my microphone on my laptop. This is a new problem that just started yesterday. I didn't know it's still going on today. So it's good to know. And I'm really excited about the Zoom calls this week as you continue diving into these topics further and as we keep going in the coming weeks. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for participating, and onward we go in this wonderful learning journey. So thanks everyone, and have the wonderful rest of your afternoon, evening, morning if you're somewhere in the Eastern Hemisphere. And we will all talk soon. So thank you all, and goodbye for now.